He needs some help up here. It's not letting him share his screen. We will get it figured out, folks. All right. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Nicole Bartolozzi. I'm the Assistant Director with the Hickson Opportunity Awards, and I'm volunteering here this morning to help introduce this session. We have Braden Westby, who is an undergraduate student researcher here at the university with us today. And just to make sure that you're in the right workshop, we have racial, socioeconomic, and regional effects on perceptions of law enforcement in uniform. And so he's going to share a little bit about his research around this and people's perceptions and tensions that exist when having experiences with police officers in everyday life. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Braden, and he is going to share some really great information with you all. So Braden.
Okay, it's not working? Okay, so like I was just introduced, hi, I'm Braden Westby. I am an undergraduate researcher here. I am working in mechanical engineering right now for my undergrad degree, and my professor, Dr. Richard Stone, who wasn't able to make it today, is a professor in the Industrial and Manufacturing Systems Engineering program here. This research project is kind of a combination of information that we've been gathering, working on trying to design a uniform or find a method to design a uniform that will enable civilians and the public in general to feel more comfortable based on the presentation of a police officer. And you might ask, like, why is this important? And the answer that I always have is that if the people are more relaxed, it can ideally help the officers be more relaxed, make more clear-headed decisions, and then actually increase public safety based on simply changing how the public views them. So yeah, I'm sure that since you're here, you all are very aware that the tensions in the past few years between the public and law enforcement groups have been rising. It's been getting more tense in a lot of different situations in a lot of different ways. And so we just want to help lessen these tensions. And so the questions that we wanted to ask were, how does the personal background of an individual affect their perception of law enforcement? How does that uniform affect that perception? And how can you kind of combine those to help design the optimal outfit uniform? And so what we did was we created a survey study that we then have distributed across the Midwest and gotten a couple of responses of the people in these uniforms shown here with the help from the Story County Sheriff's Department. And we presented these images to our respondents, and they then had to rank these officers on 9 keyword metrics. Those metrics were how professional the officer appeared, how authoritative they appeared, how respectable they seemed, competent, approachable, honest, fair, and intelligent. And then how safe you felt was one of the last questions that we asked. How safe did this officer in this uniform make you feel? And finally, we asked what could arguably be the most important question of which uniform would you prefer to see patrolling you? And for this one, we have information on a bunch of different personal background information from our respondents. Unfortunately, we have gotten very few data points. This is kind of a tricky subject, and to get all the information that we wanted, it was a longer survey. That's led to a decreased response than what we expected. So all of the results reported here are preliminary. We are continuing to survey, and we're connecting with professors at other universities in the next few weeks, ideally, to have them help us distribute to their groups and be able to gather a robust data set from across the country rather than just from here in Ames. I think then we had a few in Chicago, a few in Kansas City, and I think 1 or 2 in Minneapolis. But so this first part is looking at the gender of the respondents. And that's up over here. No, it's not. Hold on. What is this one? Sorry. Okay. This one is looking at the gender of the respondent. We have the different uniforms, and our class A is this tie-based uniform. It's the one that's most formal. it's generally only used for dress events. And so we assumed that this would lead to an increase in the professionalism and the honesty in the ones where it like is supposed to make you feel like, wow, this is a important person in charge. The second one is our Class B uniform. It's the one without a vest. This one is the most relaxed of our uniforms, and we assume that this would help with the safety more so because it is a much more relaxed uniform. You could probably feel much more comfortable. And then our last one is the Class C uniform that has a vest that has a lot of the tactical gear on it. This one we expected to either improve, well, we expect this one to affect safety a lot and fall within personal preference. And what we were able to find was that across the board for all of our metrics, males had a, well, not males, everyone had a preference for the tie-based uniform. Throughout all of the keywords, it was the most favorably responded to, with the only exceptions coming in the personal preference at the end. In that exception, we found a notable divide between, in this part, we were looking at the, like I said, we were looking at the gender difference between male and female. We only had one respondent that identified from outside of the binary. But from the male and female, we were able to see that there was a difference between the preference. The females tended to prefer the vest as a secondary, and we assume that comes from an increase of safety seen with the tactical gear based on our respondents. The males were where we found a little bit of interesting information. We found that on the lighter skinned officers, there was a preference for the vest uniform, but on darker skinned officers, there was actually a preference for the lack of vest for the Class B uniform. And it was substantial, significant with what we were able to find. Like I said, this is preliminary, so I don't want to go drawing any conclusions based off of such limited information. But if that continues, we could see an interesting paradigm on how you have to design based on who your officer is, even more so than who your public is. In a secondary set of information, we looked at the background of our respondents as law enforcement or non-law enforcement. This data set was gathered a bit before, so we have fewer responses here. But what we found here was that, again, the tie uniform was preferred. The more formal and well-dressed uniform was better received by the public. But the overall preference for civilians was the no vest uniform. And this could, again, be due to the fact that it is the most relaxed and the most casual of the setups. And so people would prefer that to feel more comfortable and like they're operating on a person-to-person basis with their officer. Yeah. And so that is basically all the information that I had. I was prepared for a poster session, so I apologize for how short this is. So I guess I'd just like to open up to the room and to the Zoom call if there's anyone there, if you have any questions for me that I can try to answer. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So the question was, how many respondents did we have, and how did we reach these respondents? By the end, we had a total of 32 responses, one for each of our studies, as we surveyed separately between the darker skinned officers and the lighter skinned officer. And how we reached these, my professor, Dr. Richard Stone, has contacts in the various police departments as he is in the Story County Sheriff's Department. So he was able to reach through some of those to reach out to some of the further reaching areas. And then a larger bulk of our responses did come from Ames, Iowa through my connections here. Yes, ma'am? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the question was, why did we choose to stay with primarily male identifying officers? that was due to who we were able to get the uniforms for. My professor was only able to bring in his service uniforms, and so we didn't have one that was sized properly for female officers, and we thought that that would kind of corrupt that data, as it wouldn't be fitting right. It would be baggy and would decrease professionalism automatically through that. And so ideally going forward, we do want to get access to for uniforms for smaller frames than his, and then be able to look into that divide and see what the difference is for the officer. So I'm not sure. I think I can answer that question. One of them is an officer and the other one is a PhD student that we were able to ask to come on and got permission to be able to put him into the uniform. Yes, ma'am? Yes, ma'am. So the question was, how did we get our participants to interact with these images of the uniform? This was all done through an online survey. And so we showed them the 3 images side by side and asked them to choose which one was their, like, to rank what their preference was for each of our keywords. So based on professionalism, you would, like, one of our respondents, I'm sure, ranked it the tie first, and then the vest, and then the no vest. And then after that, we had them rank on a scale of 0 to 7 on how much that their preferred uniform fulfilled that keyword. And so we just had that set up in a row with safety and preference on separate pages so that those 2 responses wouldn't impact the other 7 keywords. Did that answer the question? Okay.
Everybody went with professional for first response. Second one, was there a difference in socioeconomic status of people who preferred officers without the vest or with the vest?
Yes, sir. So the question was asking about the socioeconomic keyword used in the title. So because we had so little data, all of our data had to be analyzed manually. And so because we couldn't run it through a proper ANOVA because we didn't have the robustness for it, it was giving us very flawed results. And so we elected not to use those. We do have the information collected for the socioeconomic, but we don't have any of it analyzed yet because we didn't want to be reporting incomplete or flawed data. Does that answer? Okay, thank you.
Gather more data and get more people involved and have more information, who are you planning on sharing the results of the study with, and what are you hoping that?
Yes, ma'am. So the question was, once we get past the point where this is preliminary, what is our intent with the outcomes of this study? To answer that, I'm not exactly sure how we want to get it out. I know that I would like to be able to distribute it to different law enforcement agencies to be able to give them this tool that can, like, not distribute the data, sorry. Use the data to generate a tool that we can then distribute to different law enforcement agencies to be able to advise them, hey, if you are patrolling this general type of population and your officers are generally having this appearance, having this sex, any of that information that we've gathered, here is how we would advise, here's how this tool would advise that you uniform your officers for the optimal professional, for the optimal public officer interaction. And so to do that, I believe that would be after we attempt to get this into a journal paper or through a thesis process, but that is the long-term goal. Yes, ma'am? Yes, ma'am. So the question is, what is the desired sample size to get beyond preliminary, and how do we intend to get there? So to reach a basic level of statistical significance, we want to have 30 results. Ideally, I would like to have hundreds of responses to be able to really try to reflect the United States as a whole, because that's the area that I'm looking at in general. I'm not really intending to go international with this because that seems like a lot of different viewpoints come into play. Our plan to get there is, as I mentioned, we are reaching out to professors at other universities who have done similar research in the past and seeing if we can get their assistance to distribute to their connections throughout their communities and be able to gather more information that way. Yes, ma'am.
At all of interest to explore like fully redesigning the uniform? Like, I mean, you went with existing options,
Mhm.
right? So is that like a potential next step, or what's the intent?
Yes, ma'am. I would personally be very interested in looking into a full redesign. To go about doing that, or to initiate that, I would ideally want the results to be somewhat inconclusive between some of the uniforms, where you can't tell which one is better based on a couple metrics, and try to figure out which features isolate those different keywords that we want to fulfill, and then combine those into a single uniform option. Honest, oh yes, please. So we did have interest in that. Unfortunately, based on who the people in the images are, there is IRB concern about that, based on various sources of knowledge and concern through this being distributed widely to students here. So we elected to not go for that and not bother the IRB with trying to get us cleared through that. Oh, I do. Okay, I was just about to ask. Oh, I see. Oh, thank you. Okay, so yes, the questions, have we thought about reaching out to other community organizations to expand our sample size? And the answer is yes. I have been very interested in that. We have contacted a couple different national organizations, and my professor is working on reaching some of his contacts of contacts in local groups. We haven't had incredible responses from that. Obviously, if this type of study is presented in a different way, it can sometimes cause less than optimal feelings towards it and lead to bad responses through people who might be more frustrated with the law enforcement community and don't realize that we're trying to help the public overall, just based on how it is initially presented. Ms. Christina, does that answer your question? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So we did consider that. However, we felt like the face was very important for emotional connection and recognition of an individual. And so we left that in so that the appearances isn't just a blob with a uniform on. If we want to do that, we could potentially do a mannequin, but we wanted to make sure that it was a very human connection and interaction, because that's what it would be in the real world. That's true, we could. I had not thought about that yet. I might propose that going forward and see if we can then expand that. Mhm. Yes, we hadn't thought about that because we put it on with the standard outfitting, how it would generally be across the board here in Story County and generally across similar net groups. So we wanted to get really big sweeping collections of uniforms. We have the very formal one, and that collects most formal uniforms. We have the more relaxed one that collects a large amount of those, and then the tactical one that collects that whole set. Because again, when we want to get into looking at redesigning potentially, that's where we would go into that and see how those affect. As a follow-up, is that biasing my sample if you're not including responses that tend to be more negative? We are including those responses. Unfortunately, it just a lot of times there are responses that aren't taken seriously, where there are some text-based options to enter into that you can tell are obviously not taken seriously, where they enter like 7 when you give them the option of to enter in their gender and how they identify. And so it could be biasing our samples, but the data gathered in those samples was deemed untrustworthy based off of when they were given the leeway to interact. And thank you. This one?
So you said, would your intent be to make recommendations to departments based on the selection of an officer?
That would be one of the factors that we would want to take into consideration, yes. Eventually, we also would want to look into build sexual presentation of the officer and other factors like that, so you can actually pick the best way to outfit any given officer based on a set of attributes of both the officer and the area that they'll be patrolling. Yes, sir?
I'm sure this will be a thought, but because those different uniforms have different outcomes for
Mhm.
that will further the psychological harm that happens to officers. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you all talk about further down the road, how you would offset that to the workforce.
Could you clarify the first part of that for me?
So those different uniforms have
Mhm.
different health outcomes, like
Mhm.
that's less long-term damage on the body.
Yes, ma'am.
So if you were to tell officers who are more bypass presenting that
Mhm.
they don't get to wear those, whereas
Mhm.
with white or white passing officers too, that could work as a disparate impact. I'm wondering if you
Mhm.
talked about how you would offset that or
Yes, ma'am. That would go into the redesign considerations, where we would be able to design ways for them to still have the equipment that they need to be able to operate at the capacity they're expected to, while also being able to minimize any negative interactions with their communities. And so, like I said, this is my first time doing one of these. Do I just stand up here and keep answering questions, or do we wrap it up at some point? Okay, I can stand up here and keep answering questions.
Until 11:50, you're between them and lunch. So
I gotcha.
when you start hearing stomachs rumbling,
Okay, I'll keep my ears open then. Oh, there we go. Thank you. That's great to know. I will definitely keep that in mind as we go into the later phases of this. Oh. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I have another question about the redesign thing, and you might not be the best to answer it, but
Mhm.
how does color play into this? The color of the uniform? Like, if there were
If it was like a navy blue instead of the beige. We have not even begun to consider that one yet. Again, this was the uniform that we had access to very easily and immediately. And so what we wanted to do was look into the factors that we could first, and then once we develop that type of system, then expand into the other factors that we can.
So, let me clarify, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
If, I guess, are there like rules about what kind of officers are supposed to wear what kind of color and how hard to pass are those rules? Sorry.
So from what I know, I will say that there is some based on jurisdiction and department-wide conditions, but I don't know much beyond that. If you would like to.
Specifically, like a sheriff's department has more of the what I like to make fun of as the natural looking colors of like what you would see in nature. So colors that are similar to sheriff's departments, and then municipal or like I typically Puerto Rican systems go with a more dark black or dark blue or black. So that's really the only difference. That is tradition. I believe so. I've never seen it in both, but I have it.
Thank you.
Interacting with 5 people interacting with the human, which would feel better with and have like actual live results like people how you can get the form, then you know they're not goofy wild like number 7 when you ask them your gender. Have you thought about revisiting the structure?
Data collection. Yes, ma'am. So the question was if we've thought about revisiting the structure of how we collect data to be able to ensure more solid responses. And the answer is no, we haven't considered that. If we do that, we felt that we limited ourselves too much to work exclusively in Ames, Iowa, which doesn't have the spectrum of civilians that we would want to be able to be surveying. So that's why we started with it as a digital, so that we could be able to then distribute it across the country as soon as we had the connections that could help us do that. I agree with that comment. I've been looking at things like that and trying to think through them to make sure that I don't overstep anything and make sure that we don't overstep into anything that we're uncomfortable getting into.
Either online or in person, and you can construct this little 7-minute waiting period or 7-second, not minute.
Okay, good. I was worried I was going to be standing here for 7 minutes, just like, yep, I'm just chilling.
Major poster, so. Any other questions in the room or online? All right, well, let's give Braden.
Thank you.
We want to really thank him because, as he said, this was supposed to be a poster project for him. And so they asked him to come in and give a presentation. He's like, I'm going to try to stretch it as long as I can. I was like, whatever information you provide, I think will be very useful. So yeah, that's okay. You did a great job. So, and we just appreciate the research that you are doing. I think a lot of great questions came from online and as well in the room. And I'm sure, Braden, we would be open to anybody wanting to engage further in conversation and support this project, as we know is really, can be some really impactful work that's about to happen here. So thank you all so much. You have 20 or 30 minutes before lunch starts. So if you need to check your email or just go take a nap in the corner, you can do that too. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your ISCORE experience.